Ritik, it's not text-based at all. It is completely structure-based. It is purely logical. You just have to analyze what's the structure of that particular passage, right? Why the author is writing it, what is the purpose of this particular passage, what is the purpose of that particular passage, and how these are linked. If you love your job, you love your friends, there might be some health issues, right? There are going to be some irregularities in the process, right? Just be comfortable with it. Just know the efforts that you're putting into it. And eventually, that's something which is going to bring you back on the track, right? And eventually, it's very important for you to be consistent. I was a highly indisciplined individual and I needed someone. So eventually, I think you need to have some external perspective because eventually you can find your way out, but it's going to take a lot of time, right?
Hello everyone and welcome to another debrief session with eGMAT. Today we have with us Ritik, who recently scored a 685 96 percentile on his recent attempt. So welcome Ritik and thank you for joining in.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
So Ritik, when we look into your improvement, it's been a massive 110 points improvement from your initial diagnostic mock where you scored a 575 on the platform. Right. So when you look back and circle back, when you took that mock, what were the immediate challenges that came across your way?
I believe when I gave that first initial mock, I think I was relatively new to the business. Like I started off with self-study, and at that time I was hardly able to complete my sections in time. I think I was pretty raw at that point, right? And I think after that particular attempt on the official platform, like it was a whole journey after that point. I deep dived into many of the topics like in every section, and I think particularly for DI it was like a blank slate for me at that point, right? So I think beyond that point it was a huge development, I would say. I seriously planned how to go ahead each and every section, and I think even after then I also was self-studied for a while. Then eventually I bought eGMAT and so as to have more questions to practice and so as to get detailed analysis of where I'm lacking, which was something which I felt really hard while studying on my own. Because you can go ahead and practice many questions as you want, but figuring out the right mistakes which you're making, with the areas, I think that was where much more focus was required. So I believe from that point onwards, I had to brush up all of my topics. I had to practice on sectionals, which I gave on GMAT Club. And I think beyond that, I think I was able to score 645-ish when I eventually enrolled into eGMAT and enrolled into the LLP program. And I think beyond that, it was all about fine-tuning and finding out the right areas to work upon.
Yeah. So let's take a step back because we understand that you had taken 2 attempts, one's the 645 and the other one was the 685, the most recent one.
Right.
So when we talk about the journey from that bit of 575 to a 645, so why don't you give us a little bit insights? Because at this point you said that, you had problems with timing and also, you started identifying and your mistakes that you were doing and maybe refining your process, right? So if we have to particularly talk about verbal per se, right? So at this point, you are at a V81. So what were the key skills that you developed in verbal along the way?
Okay, so talking about verbal, I think I was much better in quant because of my engineering background. But I believe quant is very easy to improve because you identify a problem, you learn it, you solve it, and it's a 0-1 process. Either you're not able to do the question or you're able to do it, right? But when we talk about verbal, there are more nuances to it. It's not a 0 or 1 because there are you cannot directly identify mistake where you're going wrong because the question will present you with a same scenario but in a different wording, I'd say. So the core idea would be same, but it's not directly identifiable that where are you lacking? Is it the inference? Is it the language that you're not getting it? Is it the options which are making it tougher? So which required a lot of practice, I would say. Because in verbal, I think it was my weakest area. When I started off with verbal, I was hardly able to complete the section in time. There are 4 RCs in GMAT. I was hardly able to complete 3 RCs. I was always leaving 1 RC because of lack of time, right? So I think for verbal, the misconception which I initially had was that you have to be very good with English. You need to be an avid reader and you have to be able to grasp a lot of text in a go. But that is all wrong. It wasn't the case. There was this person whom I talked to, and he also, I think, struggled like me only in verbal, right? And I think he was preparing for CAT, not for GMAT. And but I learned a lot from his verbal journey. He told me that Ritik, it's not text-based at all. It is completely structure-based. It is purely logical. You just have to analyze what's the structure of that particular passage, right? You don't have to care about the text which is written over there. Do not go for the details, do not go for the text which is there in the RC, just go for the structure of it. Okay, why the author is writing it, what is the purpose of this particular passage, what is the purpose of that particular passage, and how these are linked. It was all structural, I would say. It was purely logical. So when I got to know about that particular approach, then I was able to see these RCs in a completely different way, right? And beyond that, it was just practice, I would say. Initially, I think I was completing one RC in 13 to 14 minutes. It came down to 10 to 12. Eventually, I was able to do them in 7 to 8 minutes. So it is a practice game beyond that. You just have to understand the process, how to do it. Beyond that, it's just practice. So I think initially I started off with like 76, 77 verbal. Eventually, it got to a stable point of 81, 82, but towards the end, we were, I think, doing 83, 84.
Yes,
On a regular section.
Yeah. You mentioned about, how you approached RC and how things changed. Was there a similar pattern that you could identify in CR as well?
In CRs, I believe it's very logical. Like CRs, I certainly love the verbal part of GMAT due to CRs because it is completely structure based, I would say. And you have to just identify the gaps in those CRs, right? It's actually critical reasoning, as the term says, right? Because there'll be a simple text-based question, right? You'll be able to identify different parts. Then you have to figure out how these different sentences are linked with each other. Like from a very basic perspective, what you have to do in CR is you just have to find the conclusion of that particular question. Like what is the thing that the author is concluding, right? And what are the reasoning which is being provided for that particular conclusion, right? Once you're able to identify the reason, once you're able to identify the conclusion and the link between them, if it's present, great. If it's not present, you have to identify that what is the obvious link between these two things, right? And mostly that particular link is the answer for those questions. I think that is what we practice in our pre-thinking approach as well, studying on eGMAT, right?
Yes.
So I think it is purely logical. It's very easy to work on. You just have to practice a few questions. I would say from each and every category, go ahead and practice them. Particular, I've found bold-faced ones and evaluate-based ones a bit tougher than others. But I think eventually, even after practice, even I was able to like score a good enough accuracy with those as well.
Yeah, right. Now, you're mentioning about practice, right? And we always practice has to be focused practice at the end of the day. It cannot be you're doing everything under the moon. Right? So now you just mentioned about the two topics that you could think of out of your mind just at this point that were a problem, such as the boldface. So what was your approach of actually improving your accuracy in these topics? How would you go about your practice sessions?
Right. So let's say we particularly talk about boldface. I think approach to boldface is different from other categories of CR. But if I have to talk about it, I would say in boldface it is much more time consuming because you have to understand the structure of the argument which is given to you. That is it. You have to do either reasonably. Other categories, right? But then you have to also identify what is the role of that particular sentence in respect to that argument, right? And there are two boldface which we usually see in questions, right? And eventually the questions, the options which are there are also closely related. So I think you have to take good enough amount of time so as to understand the passage as a whole and like what are the relations of each and every sentence with other, and then you have to go ahead with the answer choices, right? So I think it was taking me around 3.5-ish minutes for one question, and if you do it in the test, then you are just missing out on one question, right? Because you're taking time to see us for that.
Yeah.
So I believe the approach which I finalized towards end was I think I tried multiple approaches for boldface ones, but the final one which actually worked for me was go ahead and read the argument in once. Now you have the whole idea of the argument, right? Then go back and check that what that particular boldface sentence, what role is that particular sentence playing as a whole in the argument, right? Then just see the linkages, then go ahead and answer the questions. Because initially what I was doing was I was like noting down the role of each and every sentence of the boldface sentence. Then I was eventually saying, okay, this wale ka role kya hai, which was taking a lot of time. You don't have to do it. Just read the passage as a whole. Now you have the whole idea. What is the conclusion? And now just check what those statements are playing. What are the role that is being played by those statements, right? Eventually what you can do is like just note down a 1 and 2. In one, just write if it's a belief, if it's a claim, like is it backed by a reasoning or it's just a belief or a claim which author is making, right? Then in the second block, you just write the conclusion of that particular passage and how that 1 is linked to it and 2 is linked to it. I think that is the approach that worked for me. And I was able to eventually complete those questions in a span of 2 minutes.
Nice.
Yeah, but you have to figure out your way with it.
Yes. Talking about quants, like you mentioned in the beginning, you were already starting at a strong foot, a Q84, Q85 kind of level, right? At this point, you are at a Q88. So what were the changes that you started implying that helped you go from a good score to a great score in quant?
Right. So in quant, the major challenge which I faced was I think I was doing fairly well in quant initially, but I was committing a lot of silly errors, right? And I wasn't able to figure out that what changes should I need to bring into my solving process so as to avoid those silly errors, right? Along with those silly errors, there was second weaker area that was me taking much more time in particular categories of questions, right? Like I would say PNCs, for instance, speed distance time, which I never thought I would struggle on because I love physics, but yeah, I was struggling with that as well in the exam. And I think there was another section of, I think, yeah, interest rate and like principal interest, those questions as well, right? So these were taking a bit more time for me, right? So I think in quant, as I said, it is easier to improve because you just have to figure out the areas. That is very important. If you're able to figure out the areas where you have to work upon, then you are good to go, right? So initially, I think I was consistently consuming much more time on these topics, and probability of me committing silly errors in these topics were higher than the others, right? And saying the temperament is another major aspect of it. So if you're able to work on it, I think quant is an easy journey to go on and improve, right? And along with that, I think one of the major problems I faced with quant was I wasn't able to let go of the question, right? I was spending like 2 to 3 minutes on a question, but if I wasn't able to solve it, I will go through the question again and will try to solve it. And I was just not able to give up on that and move ahead, which was costing me my like 2-3 points easily in each and every section, right? So you have to be very comfortable with the idea that you can leave the question and just come back to it after the section ends, right? It is perfectly fine. So that is something which I had to like unlearn the process of like solving the question in one go and learn the process of letting go and coming back to it and solve it again. I think that was very important.
Yeah. So, Ritik, I was looking into your stats and I'm going to be sharing my screen now. So, I was saying that, for quants and for other sections as well, you did take a lot of cementing quizzes, which is the stage 2 that the eGMAT suggests, right? So, taking quizzes in a timed setup, how well does it prepare you for the test?
It is very important because accuracy is one thing. Accuracy is something which you can work on without timed quizzes, right? But it is the time solving process that eventually helps you with the exam, right? And that is what contributes to the pressure as well. So I believe that was very important for me because I was able to complete the questions in like 3 minutes for sure and 3 to 4 minutes for sure, but solving them in 2 minutes with the higher accuracy is what is required in the exam, right? So I believe time practice is very important. Semantic played that role for me. That is like important aspect. First, you can work on your accuracy as we did during our practice sessions. Once you're able to like have a good enough accuracy in those topics, then you have to like achieve that particular accuracy in the time constricted manner.
Got it. Yeah. Now, you use the term, silly errors, right? I'm sure that silly errors expands and there are a lot of errors that you might be, the patterns that you would have identified. So what were the common errors that you would do in quants? Because I know that there would be a lot of students watching this who are starting with a comfortable position in quants, but then they're not able to improve and push that 3-4 points more. So what would be the, errors that you were able to identify?
Right. So it's I think common belief key, there has to be no silly errors. If you're focused in the exam, you won't be committing any silly errors. But I found it, to be honest, very hard to achieve. And eventually I just had to find the silly errors, the categories of silly errors that I was committing, and so I was able to work on that, right? So most of the silly errors that I was committing in quant was rushing through the questions, right? I wanted to solve them ASAP. It was giving me thrill to solve those questions in 40 seconds, which shouldn't have been there, right? So just stay calm, read the question, because most of the CRs that I was getting were the reading errors, right? I was missing a few terms just so as to solve the question in time, right? And it is not required because 45 minutes in quant is more than enough, right? So just stay calm and read the questions and just write down if there are multiple layers. So that is what I started doing in later stages, because initially I saw most of the errors which I was committing was in questions where it had multiple layers to it, right? Let's say it's a simple question, like you have to find a variable x, but eventually the question is asking you in the very last statement that you have to find y, which is like 100 minus x, right? The complement of it. I was missing those layers of it. I was like going ahead with solving that for that particular variable, but I was missing that what the question is actually requiring from me in the first place. Right? So just if there's a question like that, read it properly, then write it. Okay, there's a different layer to it. You don't have to answer x, you have to answer y, and just mark it, because that is where I was majorly lacking.
Right. Now, talking about DI, because this was new to you, something that you're not familiar, right? And if you talk about the improvement, you have actually moved from a DI72 to a DI83. Right. Okay, that's the biggest jump that you have seen if we look into comparison with the across the sections. Right. So, how did you go about prepping for your DI? What were the challenges you faced?
Preparing for DI, in my opinion, turned out to be hardest, to be honest. Like even more than verbal, because initially I thought DI is something which I usually do at work as well. Like it's certainly related to it, and I would be able to like achieve a good score in it, right? Because inherently I used to love graphs and functions and most of these things which I asked in DI, right? But eventually it turned out it became very hard for me to understand that what is the standard point which I have to achieve in DI, right? Because in quant, I knew this is the right score, you have to achieve this much accuracy, you'll be there and like you will be in a good enough zone, right? Similarly for verbal. But for DI, there were two major challenges. One, there were, I'd say, lack of good questions to solve and practice. That was first challenge because it was a relatively new section, right? And second, I wasn't able to get guidance from anyone while I was preparing on my own, right? Because no one gave a focused edition test at that time, right? So eventually, I was able to solve the questions like the table analysis, graph questions. I was able to solve them, but those were taking 5 to 6 minutes, and it seemed impossible to me to be able to solve them in 2 to 3 minutes. So I think that is something which you need to know, that what is the standard point. That itna time you have to solve the DS questions, itna time then you have to solve the TA questions and 2K, like all those aspects, right? And I think once I was able to, like, during my LNP program only, I think when I was giving my firstly I started with practice, right? And I wasn't achieving a good accuracy over them, to be honest. I was struggling with the verbal aspect of DI, and even in the quant and the logical reasoning aspect of DI. I think I was taking considerable amount of time and pretty low accuracy, I would say. But eventually it is about practice, but more than practice, it is about knowing what is it that you're trying to achieve, right? Because initially I was thinking that if I'm able to solve like 13, 14 questions in DI, I think I'm fine with it. And I was legit leaving the MSRs because I didn't have enough time. Because it came instead of 3 questions, I was leaving them. I will just go for 17 questions. I'll leave 3 questions for the MSR. If I have time, I'll come back to it, or I won't, right? But it wasn't the right strategy, right? Because eventually you have to take each and every section. And if you're leaving MSR, then you're leaving 3 consecutive questions, like, right? And it's going to cost your score. So I think it was very important for me to know that how is that you have to go ahead and attempt DI in the first place. Like, what are the right timings for it, and what are the right strategies as well. So I think eventually DI became much hardest to improve on, as compared to the section, primarily because of lack of enough resources for it, right? And guidance. Yeah.
So when you went through, because you've gone through the DI course, you've done the cementing, right? So what? So you mentioned about being very specific in solving DI questions. So what were the kind of approaches or strategies you learned along the way while doing the course in DI?
Okay, let's break it down into different categories, right?
Yeah.
First, if we talk about DS, I think in DS it's purely transferable skills, right, from quant. If you're good in quant, I think you are good with like 75% of DS. The rest 25% depends on the verbal aspect of data sufficiency, which is relatively new in GMAT focus edition, I believe. So that required some practice from my side. But as far as the quant aspect of things were concerned, I think I was able to do well in them. But initially, I think DS, if you're starting off with DS, like if you're in very nascent stages, I think you have to build that habit of analyzing each option in isolation, right? Because initially I knew how to solve this question, but I didn't know how to answer this question in DS, right? I wasn't able to isolate those question statements differently, right? So that is something which is important to have to achieve. And another thing with DS was whenever I would get a option E or option C as an answer to those questions, I would just rethink about it. Am I missing something? Because those are the most obvious choices. Either you'll say data is not sufficient, or both of the statements are required. Whenever you get those answer choices, just take a break and think, am I analyzing these 2 statements in isolation? Is it that probably 1 is enough to answer this question, or only 2 is enough to answer this question? Just do a quick check over that as well, because that is something which was hurting my accuracy initially, but eventually even it got resolved, right? So I think DS is a pretty good score in DS is achievable, like 100% accuracy is also achievable in DS. Yeah. Right? Then if we talk about 2-part analysis, I think 2-part analysis, I didn't struggle much with 2-part analysis because similarly, if those are quant-based questions, in 2-part analysis, the quant-based questions used to be very easy, to be honest. Like, they won't put a very tough quant question in a 2-part analysis, right? You will be able to just solve those in like 2 to 3 minutes. That shouldn't be a problem, right? But with the verbal ones, I think that is where I struggle, which are mostly CR based than RC based, because you have to because first you have to understand the passage, right? Then the question statement won't be very straightforward. Either they'll ask you how, like the very basic one would be strengthen this particular idea on the basis of that passage and the options, right? But I remember I saw like different question statements on top of those particular CR questions, right? So that is something which you have to practice, because I'm not saying practice is to build that behavior, but to build enough breadth to cover all of those cases which can be asked in the question, right? So I think that was important. And similar, and then for table analysis and graph analysis, I think graph analysis was, I think, comparatively easier because there were 2 options to it, and if you're able to like relate. So for graph analysis, what you have to do is just go ahead and understand the graph in the first place, right? And do not keep it in your mind. I would say just note down the role of y-axis, note down the role of x-axis, and what the data is presenting, right? Because the units of that particular data is also very important when you solve the question, right? So those are the scenarios which I was committing initially. Just take a good enough understanding of the graph, then go to the problem statement. You won't find it very tough, right? Because those are like a straight application of that graph. Whereas if I talk about table analysis, I found it very difficult initially. Like after MSRT was the second category where I struggled the most. The major reason to it was the return on time which I was investing into it was very low. Because there were three aspects to it, right? Even if I was able to 1 and 2 and I was struggling with 3, I was like already over 3 minutes into that question, right? And I wasn't getting anything in return, right? So that was something I had to work on. And mostly the errors which I was committing in table analysis were again reading errors because you were rushing through because you have to now solve 3 different questions for one particular question. So I was rushing through the problem statement and the questions, right? And I was using calculator as well initially in the table analysis question, which wasn't required, right? Because I think this is something which you have to understand eventually because it is not a test of your calculation skills. It's going to be purely logical, right? You just have to identify. If you have to use the calculator, I think you're missing something over there in the question. Take a break and rethink about it. It won't be required, to be honest. Eventually, I didn't use calculator at all because the aim of the question here is not for you to do those calculations, right? There would be hardly any question which will require you to do major calculations in DI, right? So in table analysis, I'd say just go ahead and go through the data which is represented in table. Have a list of all the rows and columns which are there. Then just jump onto the questions, but just make sure that you are calmly reading the problem statement and question. That was very important. That was the major area where I was lacking initially in table analysis. And when you're able to do it, I think it'll be easier for you to like answer all those 3 statements in a time span of 2.5 to 3 minutes. And that is the standard which I didn't know initially. I was spending 4.5 to 5 minutes on table analysis, which was like costing me other questions in the exam, right? So just understand the process, like calmly read it, and if you're able to solve it in 2.5 to 3 minutes, you're good to go. Right? And I think for table analysis, particularly, the questions which were there on eGMAT were pretty accurate. And along with that, I also purchased the official questions from the GMAT platform as well, right? And I think irrespective of any platform that you purchase for like your preparations, if you do so, I think irrespective, just purchase the official DI set for the data insights, right? Because since it's a relatively new section, I think it is very beneficial if you like solve official questions for that particular one, right? Because for verbal and quant, there has been enough research going on for like years, and those questions are pretty accurate, right? For most of the platforms, right? But for DI, I think it is good to have those questions as well at your hand for practice, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, then MSR was a complete different journey. I remember I was telling you, I'm not gonna like answer MSR altogether because there's no return on time which I'm getting for that particular one. But then you told me that probably there's a chance that you might get 2 MSRs, and that's like scared to my core that I cannot answer 2 MSRs. So yeah, eventually I had to like take on the challenge to work on it, and eventually it turned out MSR is a different learning process altogether. I think I worked on my MSR in last 10 days before my exam. Before that also, I was very confident in MSRs. And I think once I do it, and eventually MSR in turn helped me with my whole preparation, to be honest, because from MSR questions, I somehow got better in verbal, in CR and RCR aspects of DI, in DI particularly. And along with that, even table analysis and graphs as well, right? Because MSR it's going to be like either it's going to be a verbal type MSR, right? Either it's going to be quant type, it's going to be a logical reasoning type, right? If you're able to build a process for each and every category, right, it's going to help you for sure. And eventually, if I look back on it, like in hindsight, I think MSR is something I should have invested much more time. Although luckily I was able to get all questions correct in MSR in my attempting towards end, my accuracy was pretty much fine with in it. But I think that is something which I should have invested much more time in my practice, right? Because it is like combination of all the questions which you are going to face in DI, right? So just giving a very brief, I think, let me just tell you the process which I followed eventually with MSR, right, for each and every categories, right? If it was for verbal, go ahead and reach the MSR and just take points of the, I would say the areas which are being discussed in those particular questions, right? Either it's going to be a conversation between 2 people, it's going to be a point of view of one CEO, then other CEO, right? Just write down the major areas or points of discussion, right? Eventually, when you be answering the question, you just have to go back to that particular point and you'll be able to answer it, right? So verbal MSRs were, I think, comparatively easier as compared to the other ones, right? Then there were like MSRs in which there's going to be graphs, right? So just go through the data first, like the text-based data, understand that what is it that you're trying to solve over here. Then just spend some time on those graphs, right? Because it is not possible that you're going to answer those 3 questions without analyzing these graphs. Just wait for a second, analyze those graphs, that what is the data that is being present in this particular graph, link it with the other one if there are 2 graphs. Then you have whole idea of the data set, right? Just own the data set. You have to know that that what is being presented, what's the idea that is being presented in this particular MSR, right? Then if you go ahead and answer the question, you'll be able to do it, right?
Yeah.
Then the toughest one was the logical reasoning based MSR. Even till end, I wasn't very confident with it. I'd say the logical reasoning based questions in general in DI do take a lot of time, right? Even if it's about 2-part analysis or MSR. Throughout my preparations, I don't remember a single instance where I was able to complete them before 3 minutes, right? Because you have to understand the particular problem statement, then identify the it is not quantitative, not verbal. It is like how you approach a particular problem, how you solve it, right? Eventually, you're going to do it, but you're going to end up spending like more than 3 minutes, right? So just build a process for it. If you're able to solve it well within time, great. I think it's very important for these logical reasoning kind of questions if you have seen those problems in the first place, because then you'll be able to complete those in time. If you haven't, I don't recommend spending a lot of time on them. If it's a like in exam, if it's if it's already over 2.5 minutes, just go ahead and leave the question and come back to it if you have time.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Ritik, talking about your 2 attempts, because you took one, you scored a 645, then there's a 685. So, what were your learnings from your first attempt?
To be honest, that particular attempt went like completely sideways. I was because I had no idea. I slept pretty much fine the last night, and somehow like around like 2-3 a.m. I just woke up. I couldn't sleep again. I had food poisoning. I had fever. It was like 103-degree temperature. I was shivering throughout the night, and it was like a very unfortunate time for me, I would say, because out of all possible times, I fell sick on the very test day, right? And eventually, I just had to drag myself to the test center. I tried to reschedule it, but you cannot if it's within a span of 24 hours, right?
Yeah.
I remember you telling me just have a good breakfast, keep something with you in the exam as well. And eventually, I didn't sleep the whole night, didn't eat anything. I was on meds, and I just somehow dragged myself to the test center, and my head was like aching like anything during the exam, right? So it was the most unfortunate.
Yeah, it was just a very off day for you. Otherwise, maybe in the first attempt itself, you would have scored it. Yeah.
And I was pretty much angry with it because it was like completely uncalled for. It was absolutely random. But eventually, when I gave test, I think there were 2 things which I learned from it. A, test is gonna be way easy, right? And like just believe in your preparations, because even if I wasn't able to think properly, I had built that particular instinct to answer those questions, right?
Right.
In verbal, I wasn't able to like particularly analyze those passages. I wasn't able to analyze these years, but still I was able to identify the structure of those arguments, right? And I was able to identify the structure of those answer statements. And eventually I was able to, it wasn't the way I used to answer in my practices. There I used to pre-think and then I used to answer. But on that day, I was just not able to think, right? Because it wasn't possible for me. I had a huge headache at that point, right? So I was just going ahead with the structures. I was just finding out the weaker areas, and I was going ahead with the option elimination process. That these 3 seem to be incorrect, I'll just mark the other one. And I think I achieved the 83 in verbal in that particular attempt as well, right? So just believe in the hard work that you've put across multiple months, right? And you'll be able to do it. The test is not that difficult. It is just about the temperament, and you have to just believe in yourself that you have put in good enough amount of time, right? So that was one thing which I learned from that attempt. That I knew I had to attempt it again because I wasn't able to give my 100%, right? But along with that, I knew I would be able to score a good enough score, right? So I had way lesser pressure in the second attempt. And secondly, I knew if you are booking for a test slot, it's better to like book official Pearson test center, because I think there was huge difference in the test center, I would say, the amenities which are there, right? So it's better to book a official Pearson one.
Right.
And yeah, that was like most part of it. I was just not able to attempt. I wasn't able
it
to
was
give
not
a
a very
attempt
fair
at that.
attempt.
Yeah, so I just knew I had to give it again within a span of like 2 to 3 weeks, and I think the second attempt was in a span of 3 to 4 weeks, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And talking about the mock phase, because during these 2 attempts, you have taken a bunch of mocks. So what were the strategies that you developed in mocks that you were able to replicate on the test as well?
Right. So I think giving mocks is very important because practice and being able to do good with shorter practice is one thing, but being able to solve the whole section and whole test in a go is another thing, right? So I think sectionals is something which I was practicing on initially, so as to finalize your sectional test taking, so as to finalize your sectional approach, right? I would say, because in quant, let me just break it down into all three categories, right? In quant, what I worked on was being able to leave the question and come back to it if it's required, and leave the question. That was, I just wrote down on a sticky note that leave the question. If it's quant, just leave the question. Do not spend more than 2 to 3 minutes, right? So I'll just so how I used to approach was that I'll start with a 45 on my notes if it's the first question, right? By the time I solve it, it should be 43 on the clock, right? Just, it was a countdown of the total time, right? So just keep a time check. Keeping a time check is very, very important, right? Do not spend more than 2 minutes on any question, no matter what, 2.5 to 3, let's say, but you'll be able to do it within that particular time frame. Because if you're not able to solve it in 2 minutes, there is something which you're lacking, right? There's some aspect of which you're missing. Come back to it and you'll be able to solve it, right? And that is something which I eventually saw in my practice session, it's like, because I was able to solve those questions, it's just I wasn't able to solve them in the very first row. So it was very important to leave them. Right, so that is the behavior which I built for quant. For verbal, I think one thing which I worked on towards end was completing half section of verbal within 20 to 22 minutes. Like a set of CRs which you start with, then RC, then CRs, then RC. You should be able to complete those 2 RCs within, I'd say, a span of 22 minutes, right? Because when I was spending more than 25 minutes on this particular set, right, then there's a 20 minutes which was left in my clock, right? And eventually, if I'll be solving, let's say, one more RC in 8 minutes, I'm going to see like 12 to 13 minutes, and I still have 2 sets of CRs and 1 set of RC, right? Eventually, it was costing me my accuracy towards the end. So it's very important to find yourself in a comfortable spot towards the end, so that you are not, messing up your final RC, because eventually, RC is something which you can score on, right? You can probably have a 100% accuracy on them. So it's very important to be able to have good enough time with yourself to solve those. So just make sure that you are well within time and not overspending time on any question, right? So that was something which I built upon in verbal, being very careful with time and trying to wrap my RCs and CRs up within 20 to 22 minutes. And for DI, I think it's a bit difficult to develop a biological clock in terms of the section, I would say, because you don't know where you're going to get MSR, right? It can be in the start, can be in the end, and it's going to like mess up the whole timing that you have in your mind. So in DI, just be very careful with individual timing of the questions. If you're sticking with below 3 minutes for all the questions and below 2 minutes for DS, you'll be able to complete it within time. And that was one thing which I followed across in DI.
Right. And what about your sequencing of the sections? So what was the sequence that you picked for your mocks and the actual test, and why?
Yeah, so it was verbal. It was quant verbal DI for me. The reason I started with DI with quant was because I was very comfortable with it. I would say it was my comfort spot. I just had to, like, I wouldn't start the test in pressure. Right? I'll just easily go through the questions, probably complete the section in time, and might have some time left with me. Right? And that is what happened on test days. Right? After 45 minutes, I was able to complete my quant within 30 minutes. I reviewed each and every question except one question, the first one, because I knew it was pretty easy and don't have to even open it. I knew it would be correct, and that one came out to be incorrect, which costed me directly 2 points because it was an easy question, right?
Yeah.
So I started with quant because I knew because there is going to be one optional break for you, right?
Yes.
And I knew there's one break which I can create for myself if I'm attempting quant either in first or second sections, right? So that's why I started with quant, and then I attempted verbal, and eventually I went ahead with DI, right? The reason I kept DI at the last was because in DI you're gonna need your quant skills, you're gonna need your verbal skills, right? So I was like able to brush up my quant and brush up my verbal while attempting section 1 and 2. Then in section 3, I would be like completely warmed up so as to attempt those questions, right? And I knew being able to solve questions well within time is very important in DI, because even till end I was just able to complete my full section of DI, right? So that's why I kept it towards the end. I didn't want to cost myself any time in terms of not being able to solve the questions in that particular speed, because you're not warmed up and you're not in the group. Right? That's why I just kept it towards the end. So that I'm pretty much warmed up with my quant and verbal, and I approached DI. So that was the idea. And eventually it was working out well for me, because after quant I was in a particularly chill zone. I was having like 5-ish minutes left with me. I had this break which I created for myself. And eventually after verbal, I was having a 10 minutes optional break. So that's how it was working out for me. But towards, I'm not sure if it's a thing, if it's actually a thing or not. But if you're having good quant score being your first section, I was finding some of the answers pretty much hard in verbal. I'm sure if it was due to good score in quant. But that is something which I didn't expect initially during my mocks, right? But in the official mock which I gave, and in the eventually the test day, I found it. I just found some answers to be fairly complicated after quant, right?
Yeah. That could be majorly because of the section adaptability, right? Because you closed quant on a good note. Like you said, the questions that you initially got in the verbal section could have been of good quality and good difficulty level. Right. Now, throughout this journey, in your last phase of the journey, you were also part of the last mile push program.
Right.
So when you look back at your journey, what kind of impact or contribution, LMP created for you in your journey?
Right. So, I think from a personal standpoint, it really depends on the kind of person you are and how you approach your learning process, right? For me, I would say I was highly indisciplined individual, and I needed someone to by my side, because throughout my life, whenever I have done something, let's say in terms of doing my coursework and everything, right, there used to be a person to guide me, right, who would tell me that this is the process you have to follow, and if you're able to do it, then you'll have success, right? And what I used to do was I used to trust them, and I wouldn't like go around and ask a bunch of people. I'll just find one particular person. I'll trust on what they're on their guidance, and I'll do it. And eventually, I have done some. I think some achievements which I being very close to me, which via this particular process only, right? But in GMAT journey, I found fairly difficult because I wasn't able to find a particular guide who would just tell me, "Okay, do this, and you'll be good to go," right? And majorly because no one gave this focus edition, everyone gave the previous version of it, right? So I did have good guidance and content, verbal, I would say, but DI was completely new for me. Right. So eventually, I think you need to have some external perspective, because eventually you can find your way out, but it's going to take a lot of time, right? If you go ahead with the brute force method, like trying each and every aspect of it and just trying what works out for you, that is something which you can do, obviously, right? But it's going to cost you a lot of time, and I don't think a lot of people would have a lot of time during their preparations, right? Because you might have your job going on as well, right? So it's very hard to manage your time. So I just need an external perspective on my preparations, like what are the areas where I'm lacking, and eventually I was working on them. I was working on my weaker areas, but on those areas which I was able to figure out, right? But it is not a standard process. These are not like very easily identifiable areas in GMAT. You will need an external perspective. I'd say you have to figure out the very core ideas there you're missing on, right? And that would require a targeted practice, because I was practicing on GMAT Club, and I think GMAT Club has a huge contribution to my preparation, right? But eventually I needed a proper track of and log of all the errors which I was committing. I did maintain an error log, but eventually I wanted all of this to be there on a platform. Like you can do all of this on your own, but it's just about the efficiency, right? It's about the process being much more efficient. That's why I took up eGMAT, because I knew the platform is pretty good, and whenever I'm going to solve those questions, I'll see that how I'm rising, what are the particular areas where I was lacking. That is what I required at that particular point. And along with that, I wanted an external perspective on my preparations. That is it going fine or not? Am I solving questions well within time? Am I having the right accuracy for GMAT or not? So I need an expert advice over that as well. Right? That was the idea of me getting enrolled into LMP. And the primary reason why I took eGMAT, because I did some research. I saw the LMP program and knew that we are having some good results over here. So I just booked a call and told them about my progress and showed them all the progress which I had. And then eventually I got enrolled into it. Yeah. Right? I think that worked out for me, because that guidance is fairly helpful, let's say, and it also helps you maintain that particular discipline as well, right? Because now you are answerable to someone who's putting in time in you, right? And so it's imperative for you to give them good results.
Yeah, glad. We are glad that we could be part of this journey of yours. So, Ritik, when you look back at your test day, so why don't you walk us through your test day experience?
I think on my test day, and even 2 days before my test day, I was way chill. I didn't do anything. I didn't revise anything. I was just hanging out with my friends because it was close to New Year all the time. So yeah, there's nothing you can achieve in last 1-2 days, right? You just need to know that there's no point in like spamming questions, doing practices. There's no point in like attempting mocks and just if it works out for you, great, but it's not required, because there is a chance that it will add on to the pressure, right? And after my first attempt, I knew how things turned sideways. I was relatively chill this time. I knew if I'm gonna score well, it's good. Even if not, it's fine. Only like no worries. I was happy with the process which I went through, right? Because during the process, I was able to manage my time well. I was able to give people enough time who were there around me. I didn't have any like guilt or second thoughts. So I was like, if I'm gonna achieve a good score, it's pretty good. Even if I'm not, it's fine only. So yeah, there was no pressure on me, I'd say. And last today I was like hang out with my friends. It was pretty much fine. Then what I just did was there's something which I think was very important for me just before the test, because if you're waking up in the morning and you are just going ahead with the test, I think there is a phase which has to be there before the test, right? You have to be wound up first to approach it, right? So I just did one thing. 1 day previous to my test, I just prepared a questionnaire for me, which I'll attempt in the morning. So I just took a bunch of like 4 to 5 CR questions, 1 RC, 2, 3 quant, and 1 MSR. I just knew that tomorrow morning I'll wake up, I'll just attempt these, and I'll just go to my test center. So that is what I did. I just woke up and just solved those questions. And those are not hard questions, those are like medium level questions, because you don't want to get stuck on a question before just before the test.
Right.
So I just did that and just went to my test center, and it was a very smooth experience. This was an official PSN test center, and it was comparatively better. Yeah. So that was it. That is it. I think the process was very smooth. You just go there, they'll do the checking, they'll do the due diligence, then you'll just work with the exam, right?
Right. So while giving the test, did you feel that it's going in line with your score?
I tried my best not to think about it, because that was something which I was doing in my full length mocks during my practice phase, right? Because the problem is that since I'm starting off with quant, right, and I'm achieving for 100% quant accuracy, if I'm not able to solve 2 or 3 questions, then I'm gonna mess up in future for sure. Because now I know
so true.
I'm like doing a pretty much average job in quant. I wasn't able to solve like 3 questions, so eventually it's gonna add on to the pressure in verbal, and similarly in DI as well, right? So it's very important to take each and every section in isolation. I was questioning myself during the test as well. Is it going right? Is it going? But I was like shutting my thoughts. Okay, there's no reason to think about it, right? Because eventually there's no outcome. It's not going to help you, right? Just give each and every section your individual and give it a fair attempt in isolation, right? Do not think about your previous section and then you move on to the other one, right? Just treat it like a sectional test. It's your responsibility to give you 100% to each and every section, right? Do not think about your attempt in quant while you're attempting verbal. Do not think about the other section while you're attempting DI, right? I think that is very, very important. If you think about the previous section, it's going to hurt you. You cannot achieve anything, any good results from the same, right? There's no need to take any pressure.
Right.
I was feeling that the quant was going pretty much fine, because I was able to complete it in time and I was able to review the questions as well, right? But in verbal, when I saw the very first RC, I knew it's turning out to be tougher, right? I still remember it was it was from feminism and social justice and art and literature. All of those topics combined in a single RC, and a lengthy one. That's why I knew it is comparatively tougher one. Yeah. So eventually I took some time in the initial questions in verbal, but I did rush towards the end. And eventually what happened was I wasn't even able to give a fair attempt to verbal in DI in the official test, because I did end up spending more time in the initial section of verbal, and similarly in DI I overspent time on one question, right? Eventually I missed one question in DI, like I made some random I didn't leave the question, I just marked it
randomly.
Marked randomly. Similarly for RC, right? Similarly for CR in verbal. So it's very, very important to manage your time very well. Even if you end up spending 1 more minute on one question, it's gonna hurt your another question towards the end, right? Which might be easier, and you would be able to achieve a better score over it. So it was a 81 verbal, which was fairly below the consistent scores which were getting in the practice sessions.
Right.
But yeah, you have to be very particular with your practicing or solving process. If you do not do that in the test, it's gonna cost you. Do not overspend time on any question. They're the most, I'd say, important thing that is there for test.
Right. I couldn't have agreed more with you. Managing your time upfront from the very beginning is very, very crucial. And, making that decision, like you said, when to let go, is it worth holding on? I think that makes a lot of difference when you're taking the test or the mocks.
True.
Right. So to summarize your journey, Ritik, what would be the key takeaways from your entire journey of GMAT?
Key takeaways, I think it would be just know why you're doing it, because eventually there's going to be some irregularities in the process, right? You won't have everything in your hand. Probably if you have your job, you have your friends, there might be some health issues, right? There are going to be some irregularities in the process, right? Just be comfortable with it. Just know the efforts that you're putting into it. Eventually that's something which is going to bring you back on the track, right? And eventually it's very important for you to be consistent, I'd say. I was a highly indisciplined individual. I wasn't consistent initially. Just be sure you do not do those things, right? It is very important for you to, prepare for it wholeheartedly, because then only you'll be able to give it a fair shot, right?
Yeah.
And just practice a lot of questions. It will build up the confidence. Because one another instance, right? Because what happened was just before my final attempt, where I got 685 in the final mock, I attempted one mock 4 to 5 days back. It was a 585, right?
Yes.
So I was surprised, because I wasn't disheartened by that particular attempt. I wasn't underconfident. Yeah. I knew I have put an amount of efforts, and this particular mock isn't going to decide anything, right? There were a few flukes which I committed, and eventually the mock was particularly tougher. So just have that confidence in yourself, right? Because you've put in enough amount of time, and you're going to do it, right? So that is very important. The mindset which you build towards the end, right? Because having solved those questions, having done all the practice, all that is one thing, but you eventually just have a very calm mindset and be confident about it, right? Because that is what's gonna help you with dealing with pressure in the exam, right? And try your best not to take any pressure for it, for the exam, right? That is something which I think I tried from the very beginning of my preparation journey. I made sure I wasn't cutting down on anything. I made sure that I was doing well in my job. I was making sure that I'm spending time with people as well. Because in past I've tried to cut off everything while investing my time into a particular thing. But eventually I've seen that it costed me my accuracy eventually, right? Because it builds onto the pressure, right? I'd say do not take any pressure, just be very chill with it, right? So do not do things which you think might add on to the pressure, right? So yeah, it's a I think it was a good journey for me. I learned a lot of things from it.
Right.
But yeah, just believe in yourself, you'll score pretty well.
Yes.
And trust me, exam is gonna be easier only, easier than the question which you practice, right? If you're like practicing the hard questions like 7 to 8 ones, exam's gonna be fairly, I'd say, similar or easier than that. You won't be surprised in the test for sure. Yeah. Just make sure you're building that pretty good. Yeah.
Right. I think you summarized it really well, Ritik. You have covered everything from, practicing, focusing on your mental well-being and just recollecting and believing in your process, the practice you've done, because there's so many data stats that, the platform collects. So you can actually track and see how well you're improving. So, those are like 100 plus data points that you have, 1,000 plus data points. So they're not going to lie to you.
True.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think practicing, believing in yourself, really well put. So on that note, Ritik, I think I would like to take this moment to thank you for doing this session today and sharing your insights. I'm sure that all the discussions that we had today are going to inspire some or the other person looking into your interview and helping them find a way in their GMAT prep, right? So thank you for doing this, Ritik. And from the entire GMAT team, we wish you all the best for your next steps.
Thanks a lot, Ava. Thanks a lot for being in the process with me. I think it was really helpful.
Yeah.